Hello, and welcome to Championing Civility, an online panel discussion hosted by South Dakota Newswatch, the state's leading nonprofit online journalism organization founded in February of 2018. This event is the latest in the South Dakota Matters series of polls and panel discussions hosted by Newswatch. I'm Newswatch Content Director Bart Van Cook, and I'll be moderating tonight's discussion. Several weeks ago, Newswatch joined with the Cheeseman Center for Democracy at the University of South Dakota to commission a Mason-Dixon poll of 500 registered voters who were representative of the state in regard to age, gender, political party, and location. The poll showed that 79% of respondents said that civility in America has worsened over the past 5 years, while less than 3% said civility had improved. One American dictionary defines civility as, quote, courtesy and politeness, unquote, or a polite act or polite expression. But what qualifies as civil behavior can vary widely depending on who is asked. Furthermore, in a nation facing high levels of division on many important topics, improving civility is more important and more challenging than just being nice. Tonight, Newswatch has gathered 3 experts to discuss the declining levels of civility in American society, government, and politics, but moreover, to bring forth ideas on how we can become a more civil society. I want to welcome the panelists, but first I'd like to welcome those who are watching the discussion live or a taped version in the following days. For those with us now, you're encouraged to ask questions of the panelists by submitting them on the chat function on the Zoom platform at any time during the event. Now let me introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. First, we have Jason Herbold, the Chief Banking Officer at First Bank and Trust in Sioux Falls. Jason's also a civic leader who's the immediate past president of the Sioux Falls Downtown Rotary. Next, we have Matthew Moen, a former Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Dakota, who spent years studying civility while also trying to improve civility in government and politics. And finally, we welcome Shane Nordike, a political science professor at USD, who's also the director of the Cheeseman Center and who serves on the Vermilion School Board. Welcome to our panelists, and thank you for being here. At this time, I would note that former U.S. Senator and Representative Larry Pressler of South Dakota was scheduled to be part of the panel, but he's battling health issues that made it impossible for him to attend. Pressler's a well-respected, well-spoken gentleman and honorable statesman who's long represented the Rushmore state with dignity, class, and a very high level of civility. Senator Pressler, who's battling cancer, sends his regrets, but did provide me with a statement he wanted me to read that gives insight into his thoughts on the decline of civility in America. I'll read that brief statement now. Thank you all for attending this important panel led by the excellent journalists and staff at South Dakota Newswatch. I apologize for being unable to participate in this panel as initially planned, but I'm grateful that you've all taken the time to be in attendance. The issue of civility is of the utmost importance in our society. At its core, civility comes down to having basic respect for our common man. In a democracy, it is necessary for citizens to be able to brush aside their differences, even if they don't want to do so. In the public sphere, we must be as willing to accept defeat as we are to celebrate victory. In failing to do so, we threaten the very foundations of our society. In my view, it is the responsibility of every man and woman to promote civility in our discourse. I recognize that achieving this vision at a societal level is a difficult task, and unfortunately, I don't have any one solution to improve our discourse. But I take comfort in knowing that bright minds such as all of you are devoting their energies to solving this most critical issue. We absolutely must improve the civility of our country. Thank you again to Bart and Newswatch for leading this panel, and I'm especially thankful to the attendees who've taken the time to think about these issues. You're all doing what is necessary for our society to regain some of its civility. Sincerely, Larry Pressler. Senator Pressler told me that while his illness is serious, he wanted everyone to know that it's not life-threatening at this time and that he still plans to move from Washington, D.C. to a residence near Hartford, South Dakota later this fall. Now with that, let's get the discussion started. I'd like to begin with Matthew Moen. I wonder, Mr. Moen, why does civility matter? What's gained in a civil society or what is lost in an uncivil society? What could happen if civility continues to deteriorate in America?
Well, good question, Bart. It's nice to be with you and to be with the fellow panelists tonight. Civility is one of the linchpins of the negotiation and compromise and dialogue process that helps resolve problems in democratic societies. And so until we get to a little bit better point in this country of being able to cordially talk about problem solving, a little bit less kickboxing at each other, I think we're going to continue to struggle. And just to put that larger struggle in a quick framework, democracy is a little bit on the wane all around the world and has been for about a decade and a half, if you look at empirical indicators. And so part of our obligation, I think, as Americans is to sustain it and build it. And that means thinking about it on venues like tonight. So thank you for hosting it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Shane, I wonder why I should note that the South Dakota Newswatch and the Cheeseman Center for Democracy are partners in the Mason-Dixon polling efforts that we've done. And I find you a great person to work with and appreciate all your insight and effort. Why did Cheeseman want to choose civility as a topic of interest for the poll, and what are your major takeaways from the results? And I understand you also may have some other data to share with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Bart, and thanks for including me in this discussion tonight. The Cheeseman Center for Democracy is interested in improving the state of democracy in South Dakota, and that includes improving civility, improving civic education, improving civic engagement, and just other measures that we might have of sort of overall quality of democracy in the state. And so before we designed any efforts to, as outreach efforts to try to improve that, we felt it was important to assess what the state of democracy actually was. And so many of the questions in our recent survey efforts have been focused on just assessing where we are at the moment and how South Dakota residents feel about the state of democracy, the state of civility, and those similar types of questions. I do have a little bit of data here that I can share. And so, in addition to this question that, let me get here, maybe we'll just go back up here. In addition to this question that started your reporting, where we found that 79% of respondents had said that civility today was worse compared to 5 years ago, we have a few other questions that relate to these issues too. We did a follow-up question on that specifically asked about, well, who's responsible for improving civility? If civility has worsened to that extent, who should we expect to be responsible for improving it going forward? And the results here were really interesting, I think. The two top entities that the public considers responsible for improving civility are political leaders. So 55% of the respondents said that they were very responsible, with another 20% saying somewhat responsible, and then also themselves. So people recognize that they themselves have a role to play in improving civility. And I think that's actually a really positive outcome in the survey, that people recognize that it's not just somebody else's responsibility, but something that we all need to pay attention to. In a previous survey that we did, we had also asked respondents a couple of questions about how they feel about the opposing party. And these were pretty concerning. So when we asked South Dakota respondents sort of how often do you think the opposing party has the best interests of the country in mind, only 2.5% said all of the time, and only 11% said sort of most of the time or all of the time. In fact, almost half said none of the time. And this is actually worse than the national results that were found using a very similar survey in 2018. Now, to be fair, there's a difference between 2018 and 2021. Those are, substantively different years, and different things had happened in that time period. So it's certainly possible that had the national survey been repeated in 2021, we would have seen more similar results there. We also asked about whether or not the opposing party was a threat to the United States and its people. And again, we saw that over 50% said that it was at least a somewhat serious threat to the United States and its people, the opposing party was. This did have some partisan breakdowns or some partisan differences when we looked at it by party. Republicans were much more likely to indicate that Democrats were a threat to the United States and its people, but we still saw a large proportion of both independents and Democrats saying the same thing. So all of these collectively do paint a rather bleak picture of sort of where we are, but it gives us a starting point to think about how we might move forward and design programming, how we can engage with members of the public to try to move things in the right direction.
Yeah, certainly a noble effort and very important. Mr. Herbold, you told me that people in your professional and personal life in Sioux Falls tend to act in very civil ways, and I was very glad to hear that. Yet you were aware of this divide, the divisions in the country, and I think you said that the poll results were not startling, or you weren't that surprised. But I wonder, what concerns do you have when you see politicians or leaders in government or industry talking or acting in less than civil ways toward one another? What's the risk if that continues?
Yeah. Thank you, Barton. Thank you, Matt and Shane, for participating with me on the panel, and thank all the people for taking interest in this important topic and trying to learn some things today, like we all are. I would say this, Bart. When I saw those poll results, I was not surprised, but yet I was quite disheartened. They were more extreme than I would have otherwise thought had I not seen them. And like I had mentioned when we were on the phone the other day, Bart, no worthy cause is ever easy. And this country has had its moments over its. I'm not a historian, and I'm certainly not a political scientist, but I do know enough to know that this country has faced periods of time where we've been not as good to one another as we should. And when I see the conduct on, whether it's through social media or on television or wherever, these leaders, political leaders, civic leaders, business leaders, whenever they are conducting themselves in a way that probably wouldn't make their mom all that proud, I start to ask myself, what, kids are paying attention to what they're doing, and they are, even if they're not leading well, they're still leading. And I think it's very, very important for our political leaders, our civic leaders, our business leaders to recognize that they are always on camera all the time, and people are always paying attention. And so it is critical that they show the kind of self-discipline that is important, because somebody's trying to emulate them, and it's going to be either done through done positively or negatively. So just always keep in mind that when you're high profile and you are seen as a leader, that people are going to emulate you, and you should ask yourself, am I going to be emulated well or not so well? So that's my reaction every single time I see poor conduct. It's my goodness, it's just going to be amplified now because people are paying attention.
Well, that leads into my next question for Mr. Mullen. How did we get here? What has happened in the past 5 years? And I know it goes back further than that, as you and I have discussed, and you've certainly been studying this for a longer time than 5 years. But that was our question. How did we get to the point where 8 in 10 people called at their homes in South Dakota would say, yeah, civility is worsening?
Well, a little bit of context. We've obviously had bad episodes of incivility in American public life. I was president of the Gettysburg Foundation, and Gettysburg was 50,000 people killed and injured over 3 days. And so there's lots of conflict embedded in human nature, embedded in human affairs. We're not unique that way, and I'm not sure that our current variation is in any way comparable to that variation that we had in the 1860s. Having said that, I think we all feel in our hearts, we all sense that it has accelerated lately, that it's more difficult to get politicians and citizens to talk respectfully to one another toward problem solving. I think part of it is the closeness of the margin in Congress, which tends to accentuate partisan feelings. Part of it is that we've had a few elections in the last 20 years at presidential level where the Electoral College and the popular vote go different ways. And I think that's got people a little more excited. And then, as Jason pointed out, every day it just comes at us relentlessly, 24/7, people who are, not the best behaved, coming after other people constantly and cleverly and relentlessly and angrily. And you not only absorb it, you just begin to feel it, even if you don't participate in it. And I think that, so there's this, longer embedded dimension, but I think there's a more recent thing that that Professor Nordike's polls have picked up on. And it's unfortunate that it's in a state like ours, which otherwise is pretty small and a lot of people know one another. And yet those kinds of numbers are troubling. So it's something that, to go to Jason's point, it's something that we need to work on all the time.
Yeah, and I would note that Senator Pressler told me that, the incivil behavior just leads to a miserable life. And that I think is something that beyond what I'm going to ask Shane about now is it harms us all in a small way almost every day, it feels like. But and trying to come out of a pandemic, there's a lot of things to be upset about, but we're hoping that we can get to a place where we're more civil. But I wanted to ask Shane, you study democracy. It's one of the goals of your organization to promote that. What role does civility play in a democracy? Because as Professor Moen told me, our country is based somewhat on division and how that should be encouraged and accepted, but handled in a civil way. But what role does this uncivil, what is this uncivil behavior, all this name calling in modern American politics? Does that weaken democracy in some way?
Yeah, I think it can weaken democracy in a couple of different ways. One is that, we've talked a bit about the sort of demoralizing effect that it has, that it can make us just kind of want to tune it out and not participate. Like it's not fun to listen to people argue all day long or to engage into name calling spats or one-upmanship, sportsmanship. And so one of the things that happen is that people tune out. People stop paying attention. They stop engaging in politics. I hear my students say things like, "Oh, I don't follow politics. It's too nasty. It's too depressing. I'm just not going to pay attention to it." And so I think that democracy definitely suffers when people stop engaging and people stop participating, because then it's no longer truly representative. And I think when we get into this, as incivility increases, it's also harder to find middle ground. It's harder to find those things where we actually agree on in order to be able to make progress on, policy solutions to problems we face. If we're just constantly throwing, barbs and one-liners at one another and trying to, make sure the other guy doesn't win, it's real hard to find those types of policies that we can all agree on that can make life better for everyday South Dakotans. I do think we have to be careful in how we define civility. I think there's a version of civility that is politeness to the extent that we don't talk about politics. It's sort of that old fashioned, like, you don't talk about politics, money, or religion, and that will sort of keep the peace at the dining room table. And I think that not talking about politics is actually really damaging for democracy. Like, we have to find a way to sit down and have these conversations with one another in a civil and productive manner. So, reverting to, well, we just won't talk about it so that we can continue to be polite, probably isn't healthy. And I think we also have to be careful not to use the desire for civility to to quiet certain voices. I mean, when I look at our panel, I recognize that we're all, white middle to upper middle class individuals who have a fair amount of privilege engaging in these democratic discussions. And I think that there are some real concerns that people have a right to feel some anger about and have some right to question norms about. And so there has to be room for a certain amount of, political unrest, of feeling angry about current systems and questioning current systems. And so we have to define civility in a way that allows for those difficult, hard conversations, but still allows us to have them in a way that's productive.
Yeah, that's important to note, and thank you for that insightful response. And that's a macro and a little bit of a micro level. I wonder, Mr. Herbold, you're very involved in the business community and in Sioux Falls, and we're in a state with a lot of workforce issues, and we're trying to grow as a state, and I think become more diverse. And I feel that diversity as a big positive when I visit Sioux Falls. Could the lack of civility become an economic issue at some point? Could we, if granted that, as Shane noted, we do want to be able to talk about hard topics, but do so in a way where we show respect to one another. But if we have this incivility that's passing down from leaders to people, individuals, could that become an economic issue in Sioux Falls or in South Dakota?
Thank you for that question. And it's a really insightful question. because I don't think it's often looked at that way. I think people look at it as political, and it's not. And and sometimes that instability over a political issue has no consequences to it economically. I'm going to start with why I think it does absolutely impact the economy. Let's just start with the success story of Sioux Falls, and I would say the success of not just Sioux Falls but other successful communities in South Dakota. That would be impossible if it wouldn't be for a public sector and a private sector working in part in harmony with one another. It doesn't mean they always agree on everything, but if you can collectively agree that you want to see your community be successful for the whole, and you're thinking less in terms of who's going to win this argument and more about how this community is going to look a decade, 2 or 3 or 4 generations from now, your attitude changes. And what's made Sioux Falls successful, more successful than other communities in the region or in the country, and there's a lot of successful communities, so I'm not saying that Sioux Falls is the only one, but their success, the Sioux Falls community success, has been driven in part because the private sector, you'll find that banks compete with one another and other industries, the companies compete with one another. But when it comes down to seeing to it, making decisions about the community of Sioux Falls, everybody's rowing in the same direction. And that is a culture that has been developed for a century now. When I came to Sioux Falls over 20 years ago, you just knew that I can compete with my competitors day to day. But when it comes to matters of civic engagement, we're in this together. And that is just the culture. And that starts with the leadership that has been in the Sioux Falls community way before my time. And it just has gotten passed down culturally through the generations. And I'm here to tell you, in Sioux Falls, you can be really good at your business, but if you don't participate in a civil way, in a way with your counterparts with other companies, to see to it that the city of Sioux Falls advances progressively forward, you just aren't all that welcome. And that's a cultural thing, and that's a positive cultural thing. So Sioux Falls would not have the economic environment that it has had if it wouldn't be for that civil discourse that exists between the political and business leaders.
Yeah, no, that's important to note, and thank you for that. I honestly, living over here in the Rapid City area, I'd like to see more of that attitude spread west in South Dakota, because there's been some incidents here where I haven't seen that, and I think we can all do our best to encourage that. Mr. Moen, I wonder, I know, and we mentioned it in the story, but you've taken a couple of journeys to learn more about civility in America and some of the issues, and also in South Dakota. With the Gettysburg Foundation and also through a Cheeseman grant here in the state. What did you learn? What were your major takeaways? And what from your findings can you apply or share with us now that can be used to try to improve civility and increase civility in politics, government, and society?
Well, I took 2 stabs at it. One with the help of the Cheeseman Foundation back in 2015, 2016. I went around the state and talked about civility in American public life. And a lot of that was focused especially on Congress, but bled over into a few other public policy areas. And then as president of the Gettysburg Foundation, I got more ambitious. I went about 28,000 miles, about 40 different venues, including one time to the downtown Sioux Falls Rotary Club, talking about civility in American public life. And I'm sort of with Senator Pressler on this, Bart. There's no one single answer that, remedies this problem, which is deeply embedded. But there are many things that we can adjust individually or in terms of public policy that I think are worth trying. And if they make things a little better, great. And if they don't, we quit doing them. So let me stop there, but if you want to at some point get back to what some of those might be, happy to do that.
I think you have the floor, sir, and I'd love to hear what some of those would be.
Well, there's different levels of aggregation, right? There's us as individuals. And so for us as individuals, it's the same thing that we've all talked about and that other people talk about. It's as simple as acting with good manners, decorum, speaking with a little bit of love, compassion, kindness. All of those things help. As you pointed out early on, it's like we would make America a nicer place to live. And then when you get beyond that, you can experiment with public policy things. I used to talk about Congress. Just some structural changes might make things better. Make the Rules Committee in Congress truly a bipartisan effort. So what gets to the floor goes through bipartisan efforts. Get rid of the 1-minute speeches at the beginning of the day, which are usually just fiery partisan rhetorical devices for people. You can think about things like public financing of elections to change the structure of the way that campaigns are financed, to see whether or not different and perhaps more civil, more distinguished people will run for public life, as I think they used to and do so less now. So there's lots of different ways you can go. You could try more ranked choice voting, which is another way to try to eliminate more extremist candidates of either left or right and get more people kind of in the solid center. So there's a lot of things to try. We just haven't tried them. We mostly just keep talking about how bad it gets and how it keeps getting worse. And part of what I tried to do is just get out there, and people would come up to me and they would say, Matt, this is hopeless. What do you do this for? And I would say to them, I don't know what else to do. I love this country. I want it to be better. We got to try. We can't simply give up. We can't simply quit. And thank goodness to people like you and our viewers tonight that they're like, yeah, we don't want to quit. We want to keep going. We want to figure out a better way to keep going, but we need to keep going.
Yeah, and it's hard sometimes to watch what happens, even with our own members of Congress. I remember Senator Rounds, after being elected, newly elected to the Senate, came to Rapid City, and I covered a speech he gave, and he talked about his stupid file. And it was a file of all the things that were just, impenetrable in Congress. And I thought, well, Senator, that's your job. That's why we sent you there, is not to collect the things that aren't working, but to look for ways that are. And I have to give him some credit. I think certainly he has done some of those things since then. But I thought that was an indicator of this sense of hopelessness you get from our elected officials, that, well, there's nothing we can do to break gridlock.
Can I add one other thing, Bart? I mean, Abraham Lincoln, I spent a lot of time with Abraham Lincoln as president of the Gettysburg Foundation. Lincoln had the beautiful quote about America. He said, we can nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope on earth. And right now we're doing both. We're trying to save it, and we're also meanly losing it concurrently. And so we've got to just tip the balance. And part of that balance goes back to what Professor Nordike said earlier too, is a re-emphasis on our political leaders as problem solvers in order to advance the quality of life of all Americans. And if we've lost the focus on reason and problem solving for the common good, we then degenerate into this cacophony of voices and this boxing match and all the stuff that we don't like, and it's not helpful.
Yeah, thank you. That's really important, and very meaningful words. I wanted to turn now to school board member Shane Nordike, who's on the Vermilion School Board. So you've entered the world of elected government and politics. If there's disagreement, and I don't know how well they get along down there in Vermilion, but if there is disagreement on a government panel or between two parties that we seem mired in right now, how can elected officials remain civil? Is there something that needs to be, how can we uphold that? How can they uphold that? And does that need to be enforced in some way? Is there some body or some entity or one person that can say, you know what, that's enough of that. let's treat each other with respect, and we'll get closer to finding solutions than we will by yelling or name calling.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Serving on the school board is interesting, and we have had some difficult conversations in Vermilion in the last couple of years. And I think that there are a couple of things about the way that school board meetings run that actually really help. One of those is that the way that school board meetings are typically run, there's an opportunity for public input at the beginning of the meeting to where everyone can come and have their say sort of for or against a particular issue. And there's a time limit, but they each have their turn. And during that time period, school board members are not allowed to respond. We're not allowed to reply. We're not allowed to be like, oh, but wait, we're not allowed to have any meaningful interaction. And in some ways that's frustrating because it can feel like they're just sort of talking into the void and we're not listening. And very often it's frustrating because you really have something you want to say, you want to make a clarifying point. But I think that like not having that back and forth actually allows you to absorb the full weight of discussion. You're able to see both sides in their entirety before you really think about how you want to respond. It requires you to sit back and listen and to really engage in the listening rather than thinking about what it is you're going to say next and how you want to respond to that. And I think that that's a really important part of, again, finding the middle ground solutions that can, meet everybody's needs. It also matters who's moderating that discussion. And that's where I think the enforcement can really come in. Like, it's hard to think about enforcement for political leaders. I think that would be tricky to have a body that policed that speech because we'd very quickly get into how we're going to define what sort of is incivil and a civil, and that might be kind of messy. But when you have someone moderating a discussion, whether it be a Cracker Barrel or a town hall or any kind of public debate, having someone who shuts down discussion that really is incivil. So when it starts to become more than just, here's why this is important to me and what I think you should do about it, and gets into mudslinging or name calling or people sort of going off on a rant, having a good moderator that says like, all right, now we're going to go to the next person so that we can keep focused on the topic, can really be important in keeping the discussion moving in a positive direction. I have yet to find anybody that I couldn't sit down with face to face and have a conversation, no matter how different the opinion was, and have a civil discourse with. But it's just, there's not that many opportunities for that in the life of a political leader. So much of it is happening online or through social media or through so I think the more opportunity that we take to just sit down with our neighbors and to sit down with people who have differing perspectives than we do, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, I think you're right. To turn away from that, to say, well, it's hopeless, let's give up. I don't even want to go there. I do find, myself in my daily life sometimes not wanting to tell anyone that I'm a reporter, for example, because it just there's an immediate reaction to that. And I'm proud of what I do, but sometimes I'm just not in the mood, to talk about something. And that idea.
A lot of political scientists share that sentiment. We often don't tell people what we do either.
Well, in fact, I am proud of the work we do, and I hope it speaks for itself. And I'm proud of what Newswatch is and how we do our business. But I wonder, Mr. Herbold, you spoke of the highly charged issues that sometimes lead to or increase the chance that there's going to be incivility or a lack of civil discussion about things. I would note that Senator Pressler mentioned to me in our conversation that he said he feels like more people these days kind of enjoy that conflict, that there's a certain number of people who they see that as beneficial. He also saw, to his dismay, that negative campaigning worked. But I wonder how, given that there are important issues, a new pork plant in Sioux Falls, for example, our social studies standards in South Dakota, what would you offer? What advice would you offer, given your unique perspective, to institutions or individuals to lower the temperature so we can get to where Shane's talking about, where we don't ignore difficult topics. We need to delve into them and discuss them in important ways and share differing opinions. But how do we lower the temperature of that discussion or those debates?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would say, well, one, avoiding the difficult discussions does not help. It only creates a bigger problem. I mean, all of us interact all day long. And the longer we delay a difficult conversation, the difficult conversation inevitably happens. It's just worse the longer you wait. So just running away from the difficult conversations in a civic or society is not a good idea. We need to engage on these hard topics. But bringing down the temperature, I think what the approach that I have seen work very, very well, and an approach that we have taken in some of the organizations that I've been a part of, is really trying to create an environment where the expectation going in is that this is going to be a civil situation. We need to be calm and rational. But the thing that has helped me and has helped others that I respect who are in leadership roles is they try, when engaging on a topic, to begin with the other side having good intentions. If you go into a conversation, even if you know you're going to disagree with that individual, if you trust that their intentions are good, it's a much healthier place to start. It makes listening so much easier than when you go into the discussion thinking that they're trying to end our society as we know it. If you go in thinking that group of people or that person is trying to destroy our society, it's going to be very, very difficult to have a civil conversation with that individual or that party. And I was thinking back to the statistics that Shane showed from the poll. You know, when a whole segment of society thinks that, or half of one group of people think that the other group of people are trying to, you know, kind of take down society, it really doesn't help. And so many issues are charged because they are important, right? They are important topics to a lot of people. And when people see something as really, really important, it can lead to a charged issue. But I go back to start with good intentions, try to understand context, and kind of take a few breaths before you respond.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It sounds like, you know, some of what you're saying is that there needs to be, in some cases, an arbiter of sorts, or someone who takes a lead role, whether it's you as an individual or the school board president, for example. There's nothing like that on social media. And I don't know, I don't think that you can have this conversation without talking about the role of social media and the ability of people who in the past might have thought things or talked to their inner circle about things, now can send that message to thousands and possibly millions of people in an instant. And I wonder, I'm not sure who to ask here, but I wonder if one of you would like to discuss the role of social media. And then also, how can you not maybe lower the temperature, but I don't know if it's ignoring, or is there a way to pacify or slow down some of the intensity of what is very critical and sometimes and often hurtful comments that people make on social media? Shane, you're nodding your head. Maybe that's a question for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, social media just doesn't lend itself very well to thoughtful, rational discourse, but it does have many positives. Like, people are able to use it to find like-minded communities. They're able to use it to find information about issues they wouldn't be aware of. I mean, most people wouldn't know like what was happening at the next county commission or city school board or city council meeting, except for the fact that somebody's shared something on social media. And so it can be an important way for people to keep up with what's happening in their community, but it's probably not the best way to have difficult conversations. And so again, it goes back to that individual behavioral changes that maybe we can relate to, that if a difficult topic comes up, be like, hey, you want to get coffee and talk about this? Like, that's a really interesting perspective. I'd like to get together and talk to you about that. Or like, maybe we could, you know, have a meeting about this where we bring everybody together, because I do think there's still something when you're face to face in a room with someone and you can look them in the eye that encourages our better nature in a way that the sort of like remote, static, asynchronous social media doesn't. And so not avoiding those conversations, but trying to have them offline in a way that encourages our better selves may be more productive.
Yeah, anyone else want to add to that? What do we do about the trolls? Because I do see them throwing gas on fires quite a bit on issues. And sometimes it's the same person making those repeated comments. And maybe Mr. Moen,
I'll take a stab at it, Bart. So I think that's really difficult. And part of the challenge of the coming generation is to figure this out. It's fairly new upon us in human history, and it has to be figured out better than it currently is. The digital revolution has flattened everything in its path, and great minds are going to have to get around how to handle it. Okay. In the meantime, I think our expectation needs to be high, which it is in Shane's polls, of our political leadership. If you go all the way back to the framers and you read the Federalist Papers, they talk about electing wise representatives who can refine and enlarge the public's view. And now more than ever, we need them as leaders to remain calm, to be the role models that Jason talks about, to mention ethical behavior, because when you mention ethical behavior, the evidence shows that you get more ethical behavior. And Shane, in my business of teaching college kids for a long time, if you tell students before the test, don't cheat on the test, it's less likely that they'll try to cheat on the test. And so I think we need a high expectation of ourselves that shows up in the polling data. In the meantime, I think we need a really high expectation that the leaders of this country, the leaders of this nation, will embrace the idea of reason, of civil political discourse, of rising above it, of explaining it when it's difficult, and maybe just sometimes ignoring it and just doing the right thing. And if they lose their job, so be it. And until we get some of those profiles and courage a little bit more frequent than we've got, it's not to say there aren't some, but until we get a few more of those, I think it's really going to be hard to overcome the trolls and the nitpicking and the one-liners. And we just as a society haven't figured out what to do about that yet.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to continue to do my best to present accurate, fair, and balanced information, and hopefully try to spur conversations that are meaningful and not filled with angst or anguish. Mr. Herbold, I wonder, the political divide, the data from the previous polls was startling about how divisive the two parties are. And I know we have a pretty ironclad Republican control in South Dakota, but do you see a way that how can we send that message? How can we send the message of the things we're talking about tonight to people who are in those leadership positions, not necessarily in your colleagues in banking or in the business industry, but how do we tell our elected officials that we want them to behave better? We want them to set examples that you spoke of.
Yeah, there's two things that come to mind, and one is very obvious. Just don't vote for these people that charge the environment more than is necessary. That would be one of the things. We have to raise our standards on our public officials. If they are not helping to create a more civil environment, I personally believe they are not qualified to serve in elected positions. That's my personal belief. The second thing is that business leaders, civic leaders have a lot of influence on elected officials, and they too need to encourage whatever way they view is prudent, to encourage our elected officials to be the examples that Matt has commented on, be the wise leaders that our founders intended to see in public positions. We do, as business leaders and civic leaders, owe it to ourselves and owe it to our society to lead by encouraging our political leaders to raise the bar on themselves a little bit and conduct themselves in a way that we would be proud of.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's important. Mr. Moen, you've studied this, so You speak of the historical perspective on civility, and obviously you've studied government over generations here. Politics is a dirty business. Is it dirtier now? I know we all have the perspective of now and the moment we're in. And January 6th certainly didn't help, calm any nerves. But are things worse than they were in past generations, or go back to the Civil War era? I mean, are things worse now than they used to be?
Well, I don't know that they're any worse. Human nature is human nature, and it kind of transcends time. And so you can have all sorts of episodes of conflict in American public life. But I think the thing that we've lost a little bit, Bart, is that we sort of grew up as young people, realizing that democracy is predicated on the diffusion of political power to multiple actors purposefully, so that no one had too much political authority. That was the problem with European kings. And our framers cleverly divided and fragmented and pluralized political power so that no one would exercise too much of it. And I think what we've lost sight of a little bit is that means, for the good of the order, we need to work together, we need compromise, we need conciliation. We need those things for our system as it is designed to work and function effectively. It's almost like we've taken our eyes off the prize. We've turned compromise into an evil. And compromise was the way to advance common interests of the American people. And so it's almost like we need to remember our civics lesson, whether we learned it at some length or whether we just start thinking about it, or whether through venues like you're doing at South Dakota Newswatch. Thank you. We just need people to sort of re-engage in the idea of working together to make forward progress as a society, and to let each generation help each new generation build the America that they want to live in.
Yeah, and I would take that next to Shane. You're working with students, future generation of leaders. What's the mood? What do you see and hear on a college campus these days? Are students aware of what we're talking about? Do they care? Do you feel like they play a role in making it worse or better? What's going on among 18 to 22-year-olds or 30-year-olds in South Dakota these days?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm hesitant to overgeneralize without having a larger representative sample when we have these conversations. But I mean, one of the things that I found is classroom environments are actually really conducive to having difficult conversations in a civil way. Part of it's because you have a teacher, a professor at the front of the class who's expecting you to be, civil and to, talk to each other with respect. But students across with very different political perspectives and political opinions are able to have civil, productive conversations about really difficult topics in a classroom. And I think that, they are interested, they're paying attention to what's going on. I think they are disappointed in their political leaders. They wish that we could move beyond some of the gamesmanship to a more productive conversation. They certainly feel like the conversations that happen at the legislature, and again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I do get the sense they feel like the conversations that happen in Peer every spring are not reflective of the problems that they're actually facing, are not reflective of the challenges they're facing in their communities or what they want for their next chapter. Many students think about leaving the state, because they want to go someplace where there is maybe more civility or greater representation or a greater opportunity to run for office and be represented. So we do see that. I think the trick is figuring out how can we take some of that classroom dynamic and extend it to another space. How can we create the ability to engage the broader public in those types of discussions, moderated discussions about policy in a bipartisan way, so that we all practice democracy a bit more? There are centers like Cheeseman in many other states who do new legislator training or legislator training before every legislative session, where they focus specifically on civility and leadership and sort of just good politics without sort of talking about any policy issues. And that's been a really difficult thing for us to propose in South Dakota because we are a one-party state. So anything that we propose to kind of, improve civility feels like a partisan tack, because it feels like we're attacking the party currently in power, saying, oh, you need to be doing this better, as opposed to just like, this is something we all need to be doing better. So creating more of those opportunities may help students to, I think, regain some of that faith in the system.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying runs counter to this idea that we should ban divisive concepts, or we shouldn't talk about things. I think that rhetoric is counter to this entire discussion in a way where we should be able to talk about things that are hard, difficult, and may not flow freely within, how we grew up or what our norms are. But I wanted to spend our last 10 minutes or so really, and I know I've asked about advice you might give, but I really want to look to us, leave things on a high note and a look towards solutions or potential solutions. I wonder, Mr. Moen, what advice would you give to politicians or those in government at this time? I know, Senator Pressler was upset about how negative campaigning works, how people seem to enjoy this conflict, that it gets them attention, it gets them votes in many cases. How do we turn that tide to where we're back to where we can have hard, difficult, civil discussions that may or may not lead to solutions, but at the end of the day, people are shaking hands and not calling one another names?
Well, I think you're right that a real worry is that the divisiveness that we've experienced so much in the last few years is leading to increasing incentives for particular kinds of people to run for public office who are probably not going to be the best public servants. And so you can change the incentive structure if you change the money trail, if you do something with dark money, if you do something with public financing. I don't know if they're great ideas, Bart, but I don't think it hurts to try them out a little more than we've tried them, just to see if that might yield a high caliber, civic minded, civil public official, if they aren't quite in the morass of fundraising the way that they've had to be. And I guess to go to your optimistic note about it, I used to tell folks that, I did this 28,000 mile gig around the country talking about civility and American public life. And I said, for heaven's sake, don't give up. We all have to keep after it. Sure, it's a problem, but is it a problem as big as the Civil War? No. Is it a problem as big as World War II? No. Is it a problem as big as economic calamity or a Great Depression? No. We just need to start thinking about it, take it seriously, which you're doing, thank you, but then keep after it and keep after it relentlessly, because that's what it's going to take in order to put the other message out there that A, this is a problem, and B, it's fixable, to offset the kind of rancor that we experience and witness and see all the time. You need an offset. That's
Yeah, and I just wonder, while you have the floor, sir, do you have a sense of optimism? I mean, you more than any of us have really drilled in on this issue, not only here in South Dakota but across the country. Are you optimistic about where we're headed?
I never want to give up on the American experiment, which is the longest, most successful longest running democracy in the history of the world. And so I refuse to give up. And there's days I wake up where I'm grouchy and I haven't had enough coffee, and I turn on the TV or I look at social media and I go, oh no, not more of it. Please, no, spare me. But at its bottom, there are many smart people in this country. There's a whole coming generation of bright young kids that will tackle some aspects of this digital revolution that has beset us, right? And so let's just say I'm cautiously optimistic, Bart, that somehow we can work our way through this. I think when the partisan division is not so close, that will de-escalate things a little bit. Well, the one great danger that I do see is that people are moving to where they want to be around like-minded people. And if that continues for another decade or two, then I think you're looking at a more serious partitioning of the country in reality or in practice.
Yeah, that's certainly true with in my business, the media, trying to play to an audience rather than saying, let's give people the facts and allow them to make up their own minds. Shane, you sort of answered my final question to you about how do you replicate that conversation that students are willing to have, that they are willing to disagree and even maybe argue, but at the end of the day, still root for the same football team on the field on Saturdays. But what can we do as adults, parents, leaders to instill that in young people? That, I mean, is it as simple as the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you?
I mean, I certainly think that's a part of it, treating each other with the respect that we want to receive in these conversations. But I do think a big part of it is getting out of our bubbles, like find opportunities to interact as human beings, like where you're not just fighting about politics with other people who see the world differently than you do. So that might be through golf league, or that might be through, a book club, or other ways in which we can interact with one another. But finding a way to get together with your neighbors in your community to where you see them as people before you start talking about politics, and then modeling that for our children. I mean, that's a good start, right? Just sort of being able to do that. We like to get competitive. We like to win, but saving that for sports or board games or video games or other competitive contests, so that when we come together to solve community problems, we can do so with more of a sense of camaraderie and collaboration.
Yeah, I think to some extent it needs to start at a young age, where it's this ability to disagree in a civil manner. I have found that bowling league is a great equalizer of people and views. When you're trying to get a strike, you're really not thinking about politics. So I've appreciated that. So final thought here, Mr. Herbold, what can we do in Sioux Falls? I think our largest and most dynamic city in our state. You've talked about trying to set examples. What's your final message to leaders and individuals who aren't leaders in Sioux Falls and South Dakota to try to break through and just get along and maybe be a little nicer to one another, even if we do disagree on important topics?
Yeah, thank you for that last question. Well, to just say it bluntly, I'm wildly optimistic that we are going to crack this nut or solve this problem. Bart, I think for reasons that we're sitting here talking about this, you're starting to see the bar raised in corporate governance, on how people interact with one another, and I think that's remarkably positive. And those are the kind of things that are going to get interwoven into our culture and into our society. And after you move through the decades and through the generations, I do believe that it's going to lead to a very positive outcome. But I think it really begins, leaders and civic leaders, political leaders, business leaders, they just need to continue to raise the bar on themselves and others. And expect that high caliber interaction that's important. Don't run away from the hard conversations, run towards the hard conversations, and do so in a way that, you be proud of yourself after the interaction is done. But I'm wildly optimistic, Bart. I think we're going to get there. We're going to get there.
Well, that's an awesome way to wrap up this conversation, is on a high note and a note of optimism. I would just add, I know all of us are wishing well. I'd like to send all of our best wishes to Senator Pressler, that he is able to be of good health. And I know that I'm sure he's listening or will watch this. And I just want to send a note of good tidings and good health to the senator. So that concludes our discussion tonight. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank those who watched live and who will be watching later. And you can continue to follow the work by South Dakota Newswatch journalists at sdnewswatch.org. You can sign up to get our weekly bulletins, and you can also stay informed about what's going on in South Dakota. Thanks again to everyone involved, and I wish everyone a very great evening. Thank you.